Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to NOAA's National Ocean Service Science Seminar Series. My name is Tracy Gill. Today and for all Tuesdays through June 11th, there's only through next week, I'm co-hosting a seminar series with Gyami Shrestha, the director of the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program Office. Gyami will provide some background for this series and introduce the seminar and speaker. But before she does, here are a few webinar logistics and related information. The presenter today is fine with clarifying questions during the seminar. Go ahead and type them into the chat box. And if you are interested in getting a PDF copy or recording of today's presentation, we will list relevant websites in the chat box where you can find them, as well as links to the SOCCR2 chapters. If you are not on NOAA's weekly science seminar list, but you would like to be, please email me at tracy.gill@noaa.gov and I will be happy to add you to the list. And now I will hand it over to Gyami Shrestha to introduce the seminar and the speaker. Gyami?
Thank you, Tracy. Greetings, everyone. I am Gyami Shrestha, Director of the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program Office. I have been co-leading this special carbon webinar series with Tracy Gill from NOAA since February. Before today's seminar, I would like to express my gratitude to NOAA and Tracy Gill, as well as all webinar speakers and participants for making this 16-week webinar series possible. Today's seminar is the 15th in a 16-part series titled From Science to Solutions, the State of the Carbon Cycle, which is focused on disseminating the second State of the Carbon Cycle report findings in relation to current and broader societal impacts and solutions. For your future references, the recording of prior webinars in this series are available on the YouTube channel of the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program. All pertinent slides and details of the webinar series are available on the program website, carboncyclescience.us. This webinar series is sponsored by the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program in partnership with NOAA. The U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program is an interagency partnership led by the Carbon Cycle Interagency Working Group since 1999. We coordinate and facilitate federally funded carbon cycle research with the science community, and we provide leadership to the U.S. Global Change Research Program on interagency carbon cycle science priorities and activities. For instance, we led the 3-year effort to develop the second State of the Carbon Cycle report with over 200 experts from the U.S., Canada, Mexico, and other nations. This decadal assessment underwent a 6-step formal multi-draft peer review by multiple U.S. and international experts, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the public, and 13 federal agencies and departments before its release on November 23, 2018. On the occasion of Earth Day, the U.S. Global Change Research Program released a new metadata embedded website for this special assessment, carbon2018.globalchange.gov. This new enhanced website offers improved search capabilities as well as content, graphics, and tables that are easily accessible to both general and scientific stakeholders. Today's webinar will be presented by Dr. Peter Marcotullio. The title of the webinar is North American Energy System Contributions to the Global Carbon Cycle. Will the cycle be unbroken? Here is some background on our speaker. Dr. Peter J. Marcotullio is Professor of Geography at Hunter College, City University of New York. He's also the Director of the Institute for Sustainable Cities at Hunter College, Associate of the City University of New York Advanced Science Research Center, and faculty member in the Earth and Environmental Sciences program at the City University of New York Graduate Center. He is also adjunct professor of urban planning at Columbia University, Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. Prior to 2006, Professor Marcotullio was lecturer from 1999 to 2001 and professor from 2001 to 2006 of urban planning in the Urban Engineering Department, University of Tokyo, and held several positions at the United Nations University Institute for Advanced Studies in Japan from 1997 to 2008. His research interests focus on urbanization, energy use, and the environment. Professor Marcotullio is currently co-editor-in-chief of Urban Climate, an Elsevier publication, Associate Director of Sustainability Science, a Springer publication, and on the advisory board of One Earth Cell Press. Peter served as the chapter lead for the energy chapter of the second state of the carbon cycle report. It's been a pleasure working with Peter the last few years. And thank you, Peter, for agreeing to deliver this webinar. Welcome, Peter. Please start your webinar.
Okay, thank you very much, Yami, and thank you, Tracy. Thank you, NOAA, and thank you, U.S. Climate Cycle Science Group at the U.S. Couple things before I start. I changed the title so I didn't have cycle in it twice. So it's recent North American energy use and greenhouse gas trends. Will the cycle be unbroken? This presentation is adapted from the energy chapter in the State of the Carbon Cycle 2, and it's therefore there was many more people involved in it than just me, and you could see their names there. It was a large group of people contributing to this chapter. However, I've adapted information here, so there's some new things that these people on this list may not have been aware of. All right, so there I am. That's what I look like, and there's my address. Please send me your comments and criticisms by email. Tell me how I could improve this work. Okay, so here's the outline of my talk. I'm going to give you some background. I'm going to talk a little bit more about SOCCR2, but I'll do that quickly because Gyami gave you an excellent presentation or introduction to that. And then I'm going to get right into the talk. The background is these theoretical cycles in long-term economic growth, which I'm using as a vehicle in which to link energy and then explore trends, particularly over the last 10 to 15 years. I will, after that sort of theory section, talk about what has happened in the US and in North America from 2003 to 2016, which is some of the latest data we have for. Then I'll talk about why we think these trends and conditions actually emerged before I talk about future projections. And there we'll come back to these theoretical cycles and ask, will they continue or not? I will conclude and summarize what I've said, and then I'll finally talk about why is this important to the average citizen. Okay, so the background is, as I mentioned, this is from the second state of the carbon cycle report that was published in November 2018, and there is the website where you can go and download the entire book or several chapters. As Gami mentioned, the second state of the carbon cycle was led and developed by the Carbon Cycle Interagency Working Group under the auspices of the U.S. Global Climate Research Program. The report contributed to the fourth National Climate Assessment. The SOCCR2 report itself was designed as a special interagency assessment focused on the advances of science and understanding of the climate cycle in North America since the first SOCCR, which was published in 2007. And I'll come back to that later. So we focused on carbon cycle processes, stocks, fluxes, interactions, et cetera, and therefore the report includes an assessment of All of this across soils and water and vegetation and aquatic industrial interfaces, human settlements, etc. It considers not only the science, the physical science, but also the management science in terms of providing a science-based information set for supporting decisions as addressed in and related to the U.S. Climate Cycle Plan. Okay. What's important for people to know is that North America is defined as the territories of Canada, Mexico, and the United States, and that in SOCCR2 we focused on what happened after 2003, because SOCCR1 focused on what happened before that. And the energy chapter specifically basically identifies the main components of the North American energy system, which I will not go through here. They're huge. You can read that in the report. It also emphasizes the role of North America's energy use in terms of contributing to the global carbon cycle, and examines the underlying factors that influence these trends, and describes in much more detail than I will here the plausible energy futures. Okay, so here's the background, the theoretical cycles in long-term economic growth and how they relate to North American energy use. In the 1920s, I think it was a Russian economist named Nikolai Kondratieff, who identified these long-term, let's say 45 to 60-year cyclical patterns in contemporary capitalist development. He basically found these waves of growth and decline while studying the global GDP. What was underpinning these cycles were lots of factors, including things like shifts in technologies, advances in knowledge, and new social conditions. So basically, after a declining period, there was the emergence of new processes, new institutions that opened up new markets and created space for wealth, right? Empirically, these waves have been demonstrated. There have been 4 previous growth cycles. They ended in 1835, 1890. I'm sorry, the bottoms were 1835, 1890. These are depressions, right? We're in the middle of a depression or a recession. 1935 and 1980, and people argue that the 5th growth wave period was around 2008 to 2010. They're actually talking about now a 6th wave that's in the literature. So this is what a typical sort of Kondratieff wave diagram looks like, and what's important for us in terms of energy is that the shifts or the growth spurts typically included these new technologies based on sometimes new energy sources. And because of the availability of these new technologies, whether they're steam engines or internal combustion engines or electric traction or something like that, there is an increase in energy usage. So on the left-hand side of this slide is a diagram of let's say, the share of the energy market by fuel. So the first fuel, obviously, is going to be traditional biomass, and that's what people did. They used things like wood, and they cut down trees and then burned them. That's where they got their energy sources from. Then the second fuel that became commercially widespread was coal, followed by oil, and now we're having this 4th fuel, which is natural gas. And there's others rising below that. But the shifts in the fuel types, as well as the massive increase you could see in fuels, were related or can be associated with these increasing shifts in economic growth waves, as these new fuels became part of the new system. So if we look back on U.S. history itself, you can start, and you look at the energy use and subsequent greenhouse gas emissions, you can actually see periods of economic, the bottoms of these growth spurts and declines in the U.S. carbon emission history. So these data are from Oak Ridge, and all I did was map them over time, and you could see the dips there. The first circle is around the 1890s, and because fossil fuels and other these types of energy sources weren't that used that much, we don't see a large sort of shift. You can see some disturbance there. By the time we hit 1930 in the Great Depression, we had been, as the world, been highly linked, or economic growth was highly linked to fossil fuel use, and subsequently, as the economy declined, so did that energy source, and so did subsequent emissions. Then again, in 1980s, we see it again, a decline, and then finally the final wave, or the most current wave, we see a dip again, starting in around 2007 was the peak, and now 2010 or 11 was the trough. So the question we're asking is that, will these cycles continue? Will, or is economic growth still tightly linked to fossil fuel energy and hence greenhouse gas emissions in North America, or has there been a shift? Right? As I mentioned, we'll use this question to explore trends over the last 10 to 15 years, and there is evidence that the linkage isn't as strong in the past. And what we hope for, what we'd really like to get away from, is a complete delinking. Whether that is possible, whether that is true, we'll have to remains to be seen. Okay, so here's some evidence that things have been changing. Now, this curve is about energy use in the USA, and what these straight lines are basic, estimates of the slope of the line. And you can see that over time, the slope has been getting closer to zero. In fact, after 2007, it actually goes negative. But what that suggests to us is that energy usage over time is changing in the US. Now, when you add economic growth to that, you start to see a very interesting trend where energy use, the curve for energy use over time, seems to have flattened out while GDP has continued to climb. You could see that little bump around 2007 where it declines a little. That was the global financial crisis. And then after that point on the bottom is around 2010, and subsequently we see increases. But what we see is energy use continues to decline. And we're going to explore that in a little more detail next. All right, so let's look at these energy use and greenhouse gas emission trends since 2003. So I have these two graphs. The first one is about North American energy use, and in this case, we're excluding energy losses from electricity generation. So what's important to take away from this is that in North America, transportation is the largest energy use. And these are on the left-hand side, the y-axis is exajoules. So you could see that energy use in transportation is the highest, followed by industry, and then electricity generation, and then residential energy use and commercial energy use. When we look at greenhouse gas emissions, what's really interesting is that electricity generation is the highest producer of greenhouse gas emissions, followed by transportation, then industry, and then commercial and residential on the bottom. And that's been sort of the general trend for the last, even back to 1990s or so. So what happened since 2007? Well, on the left side, you could see graphs of the energy use and greenhouse gas emissions together. They're not sharing the same axes. So you can see the blue curve or line is the energy use, and the red one is the greenhouse gas emissions. And since 2007, they have both declined. In fact, by 2015, North American energy use total for the three countries that we examined was just below 126 exajoules. This is the lowest it had been in about 18 years, similar to something that happened in 2002, 2003. The North American greenhouse gas levels in 2005 were about 1.7 petagrams carbon, which was the lowest it had been in about 20 years, sort of similar levels to 1996-97. When you look at the shares by country, we see that it was largely, the decline was largely the responsibility of decreases in the US, something like 99%. What happened was Canada went down a little, Mexico went up a little, so that sort of neutralized that effect. So it's largely about the U.S. And what was actually happening is that we see a decrease of about 0.17 petagrams per year, in total about a 10% decrease, or an annual decline of about 1.4%. So if it is the US, then we just sort of examine that, and you could see on the left-hand side the decreases in greenhouse gas emissions attributed to sectors. The pink there on the bottom is actually what was emitted, and then the different colors are the various other uses. These include electricity, but do not include electricity losses. And what I wanted to do here was to examine or calculate the total cumulative sort of emissions saved given this depression. And that data is on the right-hand side, as well as the shares of the sources that were responsible for the decrease. So we can see, for example, transportation was responsible for about 28%, electricity generation was responsible about 55%, industry 17%, residential about 1%, and other 1.2%. You'll also see that once you extract electricity generation for commercial, it actually increased its emissions. And if you add up the total savings between, let's say, 2007, if you want to call them savings in that way, which they were, between 2007 and 2015, it adds up to about 1.3 petagrams carbon. If you go out to 2016, it's about 1.5 petagrams. And remember, 1 year for the entire region is about 1.7. So it's almost a year of, that we didn't emit, a cumulative year of greenhouse gas emissions saved as we decreased our emissions. This graph just shows you that in the USA, both the total and the per capita energy use had decreases. Actually, per capita had remained fairly stable since about 2000 or so, and then but it had declined subsequent to 2007, while the total energy use was increasing and then declined subsequent to that year. If we look specifically at those years between 2007 and 2016, the declines are more evident. All right, so I'm sorry you can't see this. It seemed to have gotten pixelated, but this is what's called a Kaya decomposition. The Kaya identity is used to identify the changes in the various components or the large components of greenhouse gas emissions. And here's what I want to take away from this. The pink line that increases is population. The greenish or bluish line that increases after 2010 is GDP. So what happened was that after 2010, or actually since 2007, and all of these components are standardized to 0 at that time, since 2007, we've seen increases in population in North America and increases in GDP, but all the other components have decreased. They include things like carbon intensities, which is how much carbon is in fuels or unit of fuel, and energy intensities, which is the amount of energy per GDP output, as well as the total amount of emissions. So all of these curves are going down except for population and GDP, and this is unusual. So when we first saw this, we were like saying, wow, it seems like we are delinking from, or the energy use, our energy system is delinking from the economic system. So the three takeaways that I want you to hopefully remember from the energy trend analysis is that energy use and GHG emissions have declined in North America and the US from 2007 to 2016. And that early estimates suggest that they remained lower than 2007 by still in 2017. Now, there is initial estimates for 2018 that seems to suggest there's a reversal. We'll talk about those later. That the declines for these, the reasons why the energy system has undergone declines is due to these changing carbon intensities as well as declining energy intensities. Remember, energy intensities is the amount of energy it takes to make a product or a unit of GDP, and the carbon intensities is the amount of carbon in your energy unit. So as these things declined, and we'll talk more about what goes into those things later, but as these things declined, GDP and population rose, and it still brought down emissions and energy use. So the energy intensity declines are predominantly due to increased efficiencies. So our technologies are becoming much more efficient, as well as overall lower energy use. And the decline in carbon intensities are due to what's called fuel switching. And we'll show you some evidence that we've been switching from coal to natural gas, as well as the increase in renewables. Okay, so let's talk about these influences. Number one, the lower energy use per capita combined with the increased energy use efficiency is bringing down the energy intensity, and the shift from fossil fuel fired power plants to higher efficiencies, as well as the advanced and using advanced technologies as well, and the increase in renewables is bringing down the carbon intensities. So here's an example of lower residential energy use. On the right-hand side, you can see this is a graph of over time, the energy use per capita of electricity. And what we find is that there was an increase, and then subsequent to around 2010, it seems that the data suggests that it's actually topped out and actually declining. I took this graph from Lucas Davis at Berkeley. And then I looked at, I created my own graph and looked at per capita residential energy use by state. Now this suggests we have on the bottom 2007, on the y-axis we have 2016, and if they were exactly the same, if the per capita residential energy use in a state was exactly the same in those 2 years, they would fall along that dotted line. What we find is that they're all lower than that line, meaning that they were higher in 2007 than 2016. And therefore, this lower residential energy use was experienced sort of evenly across the US. That's what this graph suggests. We also see decreases in energy use in transportation, not only residential energy use. What's happening, according to the EIA, is that more people are buying these crossover vehicles. These are like the RAV4s and those type of things, which have smaller engine displacements, and therefore have much higher miles per gallon. In fact, they've actually increased, the sales have increased more than regular cars. And despite the fall in energy prices subsequent to 2010, average household gasoline consumption has still declined. So this suggests both that people are buying much more efficient vehicles. We could also see this in terms of this graph, which shows that the total urban and rural vehicle distance traveled has increased from 2010 to 2015, but the average fuel consumption per vehicle has decreased. So we're all experiencing or buying or using more efficient technologies. And the DOE suggests that this can continue, this particular trend can continue to bring down energy use and greenhouse gas emissions in the future. On the left-hand side, they project transportation and efficiency uses, and on the right-hand side, they talk about building efficiencies and energy uses. The other major reason why we're seeing this decrease in emissions is because we're retiring a lot of higher emitting power plants. These data came from the EIA last year, and they are suggesting that of the plants that have been retired, 47% of them are coal-fired, and 26% of them are natural gas steam turbines. Now, the steam turbines are much less, let's say, competitive than the combined cycle natural gas turbines, and subsequently those, and certainly even more competitive than the coal-fired power plants. So what we're seeing is that utilities are choosing to build those types of power plants, as well as the renewables like wind and solar. So the marketplace itself, utilities are responding to market prices, and they're suggesting that they do not want to build coal-fired power plants anymore. And so those things are being retired, and when they do build one, they're building these steam combined cycle. They're much more efficient, and they're using a much more an increasingly abundant fuel. And I'll show later that the price of those fuels are becoming more and more equal over time. So and this is the slide that demonstrates that. So what has happened is that the United States and as well as other parts of the world are going through what we call a natural gas transition, that we're using much more natural gas. This has been enhanced by technologies that allow for horizontal drilling and fracturing, so that we can actually remove natural gas from sources that we couldn't do previously, these shales. And there are a tremendous amount of resources underneath the ground in the US, and we have been sort of taking advantage of that, such that, as you could see on the right-hand top, natural gas now is the preferred source of electric power plants. And on the bottom graphs, you could see that the price of natural gas, because it's becoming so abundant, that it's starting to equalize. Okay, see a question here. How much have we exported our energy demand? If we produce all our goods and services within US boundaries, our carbon footprint would be bigger. So is there a trend of the export of energy demand? All right, this is a good question. And I have to, let me think about that, and I'm going to try and come back to that question. It has to do with the accounting of energy. Like, for example, what this question brings up is who's responsible for which carbon emissions? If, for example, I as an individual buy my clothes in another country that's produced in another country, who's responsible for those emissions? Is it me that bought it, or is it that other country that produced those emissions while producing that particular product? And so one of these sort of types of protocols when we're developing these inventories is called the production inventory, and the other one is called the consumption inventory. But there's a debate about which one is best. Certainly, if you included all the emissions from the consumption of the goods that that are consumed in the U.S., our emissions profile will be larger. That is certainly true. But we did not do that type of inventory only because this is at the national scale. And if we did, then we'd have to sort of account for that internationally, as well as that wasn't in our purview at the moment. So, but let me come back to that later again. Okay, so the decreased carbon intensities were also due to renewables. As I mentioned, the amount of renewables have increased dramatically over the last few years. They were about 2.4% of the electricity usage in 2004. By 2013, it was about 6.1% of electricity use, and then by about 2018, it was about 10% of electricity generation was from non-hydro renewable sources. Okay, now, but given all this, there are some caveats and questions that remain. So we've seen some of the reasons and so the underpinnings of these shifts in carbon intensities as well as energy intensities. And a lot of it's due to, for example, to natural gas to fuel switching, but we're not quite sure of whether we've accounted for all the natural gas. So is methane a true quote unquote bridge fuel, or are there unaccounted for fugitive emissions and flarings and other losses that actually overwhelm the gains and reductions, right? There's a lot more energy within a methane molecule than there is in the coal molecule, and therefore we arguably are more efficient for using that. But if we lose a lot of that methane, if it's just sort of lost during the excavation process or lost in transmission or something like that, we're not going to get those gains. That is a question that scholars are debating. There's another accounting problem when it comes to biofuels, and there's this issue about land use change in other locations outside of the biofuel production area that also causes carbon emissions. And this gets back to some of the questions that were asked online, that have we really accounted for all of that? Right, and I think this gets to Warren Deming's issue there. So, or the previous one about methane. And finally, our infrastructure is aging, and how we don't understand completely how that's influencing our emissions. Finally, these data only go up to 2016, and as you know, subsequent to 2016, there's been a change in policy. How those policies have impacted these trends is yet unclear. The data aren't out there yet. Okay, so trend summary. Historically, there have been downturns in economic activity and subsequent downturns in energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. These previous high levels were then exceeded within 12 to 14 years of the initial shock. It's been since 2007, almost 12 years, right? We're still at lower levels. Will that continue into the future? Open question. Okay. Certainly, the downward trend has in energy use and greenhouse gas emissions was initially spurred by this financial crisis, and therefore lower economic activity and sort of changes in behaviors of consumers, but then continued. Right, 11 million jobs were added between 2010 and 2016, and yet the data that I showed you suggests that the energy use and greenhouse gas emissions continue to decline, or at least are stable at lower levels. Okay, so what are the energy uses and greenhouse gas futures for the U.S.? And this is where I come back to our question: will the cycle be unbroken of up and down, or are we entering a new era? Okay, I have a very interesting comment from one of our participants who is actually a member of this chapter, and he says, if the United States were held responsible for all the pollution worldwide that resulted from manufacturing the cars, clothing, and other goods that Americans use, the nation's carbon emissions would be 14% bigger than the domestic-only emissions. And he suggests a website, which we can make available to you. Okay, so as I mentioned, the most recent emissions inventory suggests that in 2018, and this was actually produced in December 2018, that the US had increased its emissions by about 2.5%. Well, that's really a different trend since we had been decreasing by about 1.4% annually. Now we see an increase. So it might be that we come back and that we're going to see an increase again, and that this the trend, the cycle will not be broken. However, other projections vary widely. And this is now what we did here was we took projections by the different countries and put them together into three different explorations. One would be the high, one would be what we call the reference or sort of the medium, and the other is the low. And what the table next to it suggests that the results can be somewhere between 3% higher in the future by 2040 or 13% lower. So within that range is our plausible future. That's not very helpful. Some might say it's a very, very wide range. Others have suggested that rather than sort of looking at these possible projections, that let's look at our ability to reduce emissions by 2050 by 50 and 80%. And this is the results of this very, very big study that was produced by the Energy Modeling Forum back around 2010, 2012. And what this says is that there are somewhere between, let's say, 6 and 8 models, and these are global assessment models, environmental assessment models, and they suggest that it is indeed possible for the U.S. to lower their emissions by 50% or by 80% in the future, given current technologies. However, it's going to cost. And the cost is to bring down emissions to 80%, which would put us on a 1.5 to 2 degree increase in climate, would cost somewhere between 1 and 4 trillion. That's net present value. What that means is that if you took the cost cumulative across the next, let's say, 30 years or 40 years, and then said, okay, how much would it cost now? It's about at the high end, it's about the U.S. budget, U.S. government budget, $4 trillion, right? It's not necessarily out of our ability to handle, because of course that cost would be incurred across that period of time. So basically, future scenario projections suggest that energy use and greenhouse gas emissions can increase somewhere, by 3% or decrease by about 13% from 2005 levels into 2040. However, other research also suggests that it is possible to reduce our emissions by between 50 and 80% of 2010 emissions by 2050. What is emphasized in that previous study, which I didn't mention, is that they suggest that technology and markets alone will not get us there. That's actually policy is necessary to help in what's called this radical transition. As I mentioned, the cumulative cost will be something around between 1 and 4 trillion net present value of $2005. Okay, so in conclusions, mention again, the North American energy use and carbon-related emissions have declined from 2007 to 2016 and even to 2017. These declines were driven by decreases in energy intensities, resulting from more efficient energy technologies, lower energy use, and decreases in carbon intensities driven by increased renewables and fuel switching. Notwithstanding the significant GHG savings, i.e. 1.5 petagrams carbon, the downward trend is not enough to get us to what we want is a 2-degree climate trajectory. And technologies and market conditions will not get us there also. It is possible to get there, however, with if we decide to, if as a society decide to, and put this investment into it, as well as to use policy to help the system along. Okay, that's basically what I'd like to say, and then quickly I'd like to talk about why is this important. So why should we care? Well, there's at least 5 reasons why we should care about our energy use and greenhouse gas trends and future energy futures. Number 1, energy is an essential part of our daily lives. It has been the access to reliable, plentiful, and cheap energy that has allowed us as a country, and I'm talking as an American, to be so successful. And we always have had, we've always been a major energy consumer. So if we, because well-being is so linked to that, we want to know what's going on with it, and we want to understand future trends. Using energy, however, does not come without a price, right? It's like anything else. If you eat too much cake, there's going to be a price to that. In this case, there's a direct cost. I mean, we have to pay for it. Number 2, it is a non-renewable resource, and ultimately, it potentially can run out. And third, it has what economists call environmental externalities. That is, there are things that are unpriced that are actually negative for society. So understanding how to use energy wisely with greater efficiency and cleaner sources will reduce not only financial costs, but increase the lifespan of the resource and lower what's called pollution levels. Now, of this thing of pollution, it includes things like local concerns, such as those related to ambient air, water quality, as well as land degradation. It also includes reducing risks of climate change and threats to future generations of Americans. And those are my reasons, or the answers to the so what question, or why we should care about this. You can prioritize them any way you'd like. Okay. And that is basically the end of my talk. Again, there is my contact info, and you can email me. I got lots of questions here, and I will try. I guess I should try and get to these, or how should this work now, Tracy?
Yeah, that's great, Peter. Thank you so much for a great presentation. And if you would just take the questions, just read them, and then answer them. The next one you're addressing is Nancy's.
Right. Okay. So thank you, Nancy, for this comment, which I failed to mention is if we're just talking about the cost of reducing our emissions, we're not including the huge cost associated with not addressing them. So that is not included in this, in the calculations. If, for example, we don't include if we don't address reducing our emissions, there will be other costs that could be even higher than what I suggested. Okay. And there's a question about how accurate have past GHG emission studies been, and have there been any surprises in the differences? Well, this is a great question. It has to do or points to uncertainties. How certain are we of these data? Well, there was a study that was associated with the SOCCR2, and there is variation among the estimates. Is that variation large? Off the top of my head, I don't remember. I don't, from what I see in the data, There is variation, and I unfortunately I can't. It hasn't been enormous, if you will. We're not talking about orders of magnitude, but there, it's up there. My guess, and I'm guessing now, between 1 and 10%. And that's all the questions. Anyone else have any questions or comments?
Wait,
we have about 10 minutes.
You answered?
I'm sorry? Yeah, I got Christian Menning.
Yeah,
yeah, right. I think that had to do with the certainty of the data.
Oh, okay. Looks like there might be a few more questions coming.
Okay. Right. Jim Butler's question was about exporting energy demand, which I thought I addressed a little bit. If we produced all our goods and services within our boundaries, it wouldn't, we wouldn't, our carbon footprint would be much higher. I think James McMahon suggested that if we did do a consumption-related budget, it could be up to 14% bigger than it is now. And there is a website. I don't know how to put this to give this website to everybody, but it's from New York. It's an article in the New York Times, 2018.
Peter, they can click on it and it'll open right up in their browser.
Because they could see this too?
Yes.
Okay, great. Anyone else?
Yami has.
Can you provide a related local level New York example of energy carbon sustainability? Okay, that's a great question. We have a whole chapter on the urban aspect of the carbon cycle. As you might already know, that cities are responsible for arguably the lion's share of these emissions because that's where people are concentrated, that's where economic activity is concentrated, that's where energy use is concentrated. So total energy is typically larger in urban areas because of the high concentration of activities and population than in suburban and exurban areas. However, if you look at the per capita production of emissions or the per capita consumption of energy, it's much lower, right? And this has been demonstrated through scope one, what's called scope one, which is the strictly production related, as well as scope two, which includes emissions from electricity, which, as I showed, are in the U.S. is like over 54% of emissions come from electricity. Still, people in cities are more efficient than those living outside cities. Now, we believe that's true because of the building sector, because a lot of us in cities live in apartments and we're reducing our heating load, et cetera, as well as transportation. We use less cars in cities. We use more mass transit, that kind of thing, than in suburban and rural areas. So their per capita usages are higher. This is what leads to many planners to suggest that we want to compact our cities so that we can reduce our energy as opposed to spreading people out on the landscape like smooth peanut butter on white bread. Okay, let's see. Could you provide a local level? Okay, then Gami, give something. Okay, James Butler came back. My second question was about cost. I think it was skipped. You're right, I did skip that. So is there a trend in the export of energy demand? So in other words, is that what it was, or is there another question in here? Okay.
It says, so is that a cost to the, can you see it? So is that a cost to the company, reduced income, or a savings to the customer, increased savings?
I see it. The concept of cost is confusing. One man's cost is another man's profit. How exactly are costs computed? My understanding that installing renewables allows for lower cost production so that a cost of the company reduced. Okay, so cost in terms of what context are we talking about here? How exactly the cost computed? The cost for the net present value is that, I think he's talking about that. And those costs, I think, are due to various infrastructure policies and outcomes that way. And I think perhaps what Nancy Cavallero was mentioning is that there are other costs associated, opportunity costs maybe, that if you don't do that, there'll be different types of costs, which could even be higher. So, what about it? So maybe that is getting to it. Right, we have to understand exactly how costs are computed in all these studies. But I don't understand the second part. Installing renewables allows for lower cost production. So that a cost to a company, reduced income, or savings to the consumer. I'm a little confused. I'm sorry. I'm just not getting it. Well, so let me look at Sarah's question. What would be the implication of a major shift in electric vehicles? Great question. And I think that seems to be the way that particularly things are happening in cities. If you travel in other places around the world, you see a lot of electric vehicles. They may not be cars, they may be bicycles, they may be scooters, they may be that type of thing, or but I see a lot of them in different cities. Now, the savings would depend on how we make our electricity, right? If you make your electricity using coal, you might not get savings, versus if you make your electricity using renewables, you would get tremendous savings. So that, so it depends. Therefore, it depends. And I think there's actually studies that have looked across the U.S. by state, looking at different savings depending on of electric vehicles, depending on what their source of electricity is. Okay, Yami says, oh, okay, she could see more stuff there. Okay, the recordings are available on this line. You could listen to this again. Okay. Is there enough renewable energy for the U.S. to be able to? Okay, great question, Tracy. And there's a debate about this. There are some that say absolutely, and there are studies out there that suggest that yes, we can go entirely renewable. There's other studies that suggest that no, that's not possible. And as James Butler suggests, that it's all a matter of your methodology and how you do this accounting. So it depends on who you're talking to. I can point you to studies, and I'm happy to do that, that suggest that that have actually done the calculations and say, yeah, we can go 100% renewable. Some of the things you want to think about at this point is that renewables are there when the renewable resource is active, whether it's the sun or the wind. If there is no sun and there is no wind, these are non-hydro renewables. Hydro makes up about a significant portion of our energy source, but could not cover all of it. So in terms of the non-hydro stuff, if there is no wind and there is no sun, then there is no energy. So it really depends on our ability to store that particular source. And those types of batteries, although people are developing them and they're increasing their capacity as well as their reliability is increasing by the day, I don't think at this moment we can do that. Although maybe other people know better than I do.
Okay, thanks.
Right, and I think we're at there's a couple more questions here, but I think we're at time.
Okay. All right, well, if you guys want to, the folks who still have comments, James and Sarah, you can email Peter directly. There's his email. Thanks for joining us, everybody. And we have our last talk. Yami, do you want to mention it for next week?
Sure. Thank you so much, Peter. I think we could probably spend a couple more minutes if Peter has the time to answer these questions. But before he does that, if he wants to quickly, next week will be our last webinar of the 16-part series. And I mean, for now, possibly we may resume the series in the fall, and we will let everyone know if we do. So next Tuesday, there will be 2 seminars. The first one will be focused on urban carbon by Dr. Kevin Gurney from Northern Arizona University. And then the second talk will be sort of an overview. So Tracy Gill, my co-host for this webinar series, asked me to provide like sort of a wrap-up of this series. And so I decided to focus on some interesting topics. And so the title of the webinar will be Cows, Dirt, Smoke, Water, A State of the Carbon Story. And I will deliver that. Thanks, everyone. And Peter, if you have a few more minutes, you could stay on for a few minutes.
Well, I think that James McMahon already answered Sarah Green's question with another URL, and I think I'm understanding what James Butler has been suggesting is that, if we only talk about costs, we're missing out on sort of the other side of the equation. So, and I think again this gets back to Nancy Cavaliero's point: if we don't spend the money doing something, there are going to be penalties down the line that could be even greater. There's also benefits, right? The benefits of doing this are not necessarily weighed in that equation. So, and you could think about it in terms of, let's see, if I saved money now, there would be a certain cost that I wouldn't be able to spend that money at this moment. I would put it in the bank, but then later on down the road, I would have money in the bank so that I could use that money for the things I would want. And if I did use it now, I wouldn't have it then. So there is benefits of this action, of the actions that we do now, that will be that we can look at costs, but there are actually benefits in terms of saving, for example, savings from future heat. If you subscribe to climate change theory, climatologists tell us that temperatures will rise and that heat waves will potentially become more intense. That if we reduce our emissions now, and those emissions subsequently help to reduce the effects of climate change, then in the future we will benefit. We will benefit from not having that type of action. And I think, or not having to experience those type of conditions and trends. And I think this is what James Butler's getting at. I hope so. But if not, I'm going to stop there anyway. And
that's fine. So thanks so much. This has been really interesting. I never understood how things are changing, and the questions were very illuminating too. So thanks so much for joining us, Peter. And Gyami, do you have any last words, or Peter, do you?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for joining us, and we hope you can join us next week for our last talk. Bye everybody. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.